Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive, said author Howard Thurman. Welcome to the second season of the Vulnerable Power Show. Heart-to-heart, unscripted dialogues with world leaders who are shining examples of the unfolding leadership ascension. Hear from these creative leaders and visionary entrepreneurs who have traversed deep leadership transformations and inner alchemy, actualizing their vision for a better world. We share raw insights and practical tips so you too can transform painful experiences and old energies as fuel for your leadership growth and collective good. Join us and listen in so we can all bring hope, inspire transformation, uplift the world, and show what is possible through heart-centered, vulnerable leadership. As Margaret Mead, anthropologist, once said, "Never believe that a few caring people can't change the world. For indeed, that's all who ever have." Everybody, greetings and welcome back to another episode of the Vulnerable Power Show, a deep dive into the heart of leadership where we spotlight leaders around the world that are making a practical impact. And our intention here is to drop you into this immersive experience, to this raw, candid chat as this leader that's with us today, Paul, is going to share some very powerful and impactful wisdom with us. So we're here to inspire you wherever you are in your leadership journey, that you too can take the steps to transform your life and your work. We're here to empower you, to show you practical wisdom and infuse the conversation with tips and practical wisdom that'll allow you to feel empowered to do it and to encourage you that you can do it, to confront the fear and transform it. As always, I like to start with how I met our guest. So Paul and I actually met through the Vulnerable Power Show. He saw the episode we had this season with William, who does a lot of crypto and novel work in that space. And when he reached out, I'm following a lot of inspiration these days to show this new way, not necessarily thinking, going more with these extrasensory gifts. And when we sat down and chatted initially, I was like, Paul, you're an OG, what I call an original gangster in this space of impact and leadership and bringing and leveraging spirituality. And it dropped in. I said, Paul, why don't you come on the Vulnerable Power Show? And here we are today. So without further ado, Paul, thank you so much for not only being here today, for opening yourself up and being receptive to so much of this work that you've been leading in the world.
Thanks so much for having me, Haas. It's great to connect with you. It's been really enjoyable. And congratulations as somebody who's built a podcast that has a certain degree of following. I know what it takes. And just thank you for holding this space. It's such a generous gift to give the world, to get these awesome people, ask them what they're doing, unpack it, and give it away for free. That is an incredible gift, and thank you.
The resonance is mutual, brother. The resonance is mutual. And of course, we had to get you on the other side of the mic with your podcast, which you may talk about here today. So that's another reason I'm like, hey, how about you be interviewed? And I know you do that occasionally. So that's awesome, bro. And the resonance is mutual. And thank you again. So we don't like to waste time. The real premise we like to start with, Paul, and you kind of know the general gist of it, is what made Paul the leader he is today? What, your journey, your inner alchemical journey, as I call it, this transformational work. Where did it start for you? Kind of like a before and after, and then leading us to the work you're doing now with Awarepreneurs, which the brand is behind you. So wherever you feel inspired to start, however you want to kind of take it. And then as everybody knows that follows along, we like to go with a general flow and inspired and unscripted. So let's get going and dive deep.
Yeah. The sort of critical moment for me, Haas, when I was in high school, I was starting to get into some significant trouble with drugs and alcohol. And there was a particularly hard incident when I was 17 years old. And through a set of circumstances, I wound up meeting a very wise woman. And she did me a gift that, she gave me a gift that changed my life. When she was 17 years old, she explained my nervous system to me. She said, Paul, so here's the deal. She heard it, what's going on. And like, I was all ashamed and, like was just really feeling a lot of angst. And she said, here's the deal. You're wired for poignant experiences. You're wired for poignant experiences, she said. And this goes one of two ways. People with your kind of nervous system either have a lifetime of drama and addiction, you probably die young, or there's these paths, like they're called awareness practices or spiritual practices. There's a lot of them out there. I don't care which one you pick, but pick one. You'll have a really good life. You'll be of service. You'll feel an incredible sense of meaning. You'll feel alive. You'll feel awake. And I heard her, Haas. And the reason I heard her, just so people are listening, like if you ever find yourself in a moment like this, she had no stake. She wasn't trying to recruit me for her mastermind group. She wasn't trying to get me to go to her guru, or she wasn't a guru. She just said, here's how you're wired. And it turns out she was right. And we can talk about that later. And I heard her, and I started like learning about meditation and spirituality. And when I went off to college, I studied psychology. And for my master's program, I actually wound up going to Lesley University. It was an awareness-based counseling program. I entered in 1989 at 20 years old. And we were like 13 miles down the road from John Kabat-Zinn, who many people might recognize as sometimes called the grandfather of the modern mindfulness movement. Many of my professors were his earliest students. And like, that's been, like that conversation at 17 literally changed the trajectory of my life.
I love that, because there is like this unconditionality as you presented, that this is like what I would call a way show, or somebody that was doing it from a place of service, which is, I know, a very big shared purpose and value between our bond and in our space. So if you can elaborate a little bit, because that's really potent information that you were offered at such a tender age, and it definitely speaks to you being what I would call an old soul. Can you preliminarily, since you alluded to it, what kind of information did she give you, and then how did that enhance your understanding about yourself? Because I know you and I know the importance of knowing how you tick and what makes you operate, and we're all wired differently. Right. So what was it, if you can start to dive into that, and then continuing, since we're already here, what was the gist of what you recall, and then how it relates to what it did for your awareness and in terms of how it shifted you?
The beautiful thing has like, she listened, like, tell me what happened. It sounds like it was rough. And I talked, and my shame and I was scared. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. I had hurt some people that I cared about, some of my best friends. I was in a really poignant moment. The beautiful part is how she didn't say much more than what I told, like literally. She listened, and it's that beautiful empathetic listening skill that a really wise person, you can talk about it, but when you're in a tough moment and somebody's doing it, you can't just talk about it. She was really listening. She wasn't judging me. And then she just she laid it out with both care, but I've also heard the poet David White talk about grandmotherly fierceness, right? Like, she had to be 40 or 50 years older than I was. She had seen some things. She was an astrologer and a wise woman. And she just didn't beat around the bush. She just said, here's how you're wired. And like, take care of business, dude. You're a smart kid. Let me help you, point you in the right direction, and go figure it out.
What did you learn? What did you learn about yourself through that? It sounds like, it was more existential, and then it allowed you to then hold that container to, for providing that space for you to alchemize, as I call it, the shame, the guilt, and then be heard. Very Maslowian, you felt heard, seen. And then that does a lot, because obviously, as you alluded to, you went into counseling and all that, which we'll get to. So how did that enhance you, or when I say enhance, how did that shift your awareness, and what did you learn about yourself through that dialogue?
The embodied experience house, if anybody's ever played when you're a kid and you're at a birthday party and you played pin the tail on the donkey, and they put the blindfold on and they spin you around and they give you the little thing, and you're supposed to try to put the tail on the donkey. If anybody's from a culture where you don't play that, sorry, it's just the reference point, right? It's literally a kid's game where you blindfold, they spin you around, and then they point you in the general direction, and you're just like, she took the blindfold off. That's she just said, here's your nervous system, there's the donkey, And like what you want to do is get this thing pinned in the realm of some sort of spiritual or awareness practice. And then she just let me go, just like in a good pin the tail on the donkey game. The person spinning you around, they don't micromanage you. They just say, you're going to get this pointed in the right direction. Yes, you're a little disoriented, but if you trust me and keep headed the way I point you, you're going to do just fine. That's literally all she did. And it was genius. It was just a genius moment of a wise woman in action.
I love that. That's that classic Taoist tradition. They say that the teacher shows you where to look, not what to see. So it sounds like in that pin the tail on the donkey analogy. So she shifted what we call the veils, right? It's almost like it's unveiling you and you're like, whoa. So you had this enhanced awareness and then you ran with it. So I love that you dived in right away. I think
and I was like a senior in high school and suddenly I was hanging out with Father Joe Gilligan, this incredible Catholic priest. He had to be in his mid to late 70s. We found out soon he was dying of brain cancer. He had traveled the world. He spoke 9 languages fluently. And there's a bunch of young people, I'm a Jew from New York, and he was an Irish Catholic priest who had traveled the world teaching in a different tradition. But I remember his eyes, House. He had some of the most sparkling eyes, and he just loved life. And I found this little crew of young people who are really passionate about exploring spirituality. And we would hang out with Father Joe and other, very wise people. And it wasn't about the tradition. I did a lot of exploring from the years. I mean, I still explore, but a lot, particularly from the ages of, let's say, almost 18. From 18 to 25, Sufism and contemplative Christianity and my own Jewish roots and Buddhism and Taoism. It was just oh my gosh, look at human wisdom. So she pointed me in the direction and I just ran with meditations and just practices from around the world, got a master's degree, and now we would call it psychoneuroimmunology, literally the mechanics of the mind-body.
Go slow. Psycho, one more time for those that haven't studied this field, which I studied psychology too, so I know it.
PNI is the psycho, meaning psychology, neuro, meaning the brain, right? So the emotional and brain, and then immunology, the immune system. So basically, it's the scientific language for the mind-body connection as it relates to health, right?
Wow.
So when I was in Boston and I was at Lesley University, in one direction was John Kabat-Zinn and the foundation of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which he is the founder of. That literally happened at a hospital. It was in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he was studying what happens when you teach people mindfulness for various ailments that somebody would show in a hospital system. Somebody who had a heart attack, somebody who was having anxiety, somebody who was having digestive disorders. They were literally looking at it in a very, now we think of mindfulness in a very broad, but they were looking at it in a medical research hospital. And then Herbert Benson, who wrote the relaxation response.
Wow.
Anybody's ever talked about the different pathways of the nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system, you were standing on Herbert Benson's shoulders, whether you know it or not. He was at Harvard, 2 miles from where I went to grad school. And then Joan Borisenko, who studied women's behavioral health and mindfulness, she was at MIT. So it was this hotbed in Boston. This was in Boston. In the early 90s, of people who were looking at awareness and mindfulness practices in these very specific ways, not in a loose way, but for very particular purposes. And I was coming up I started before I was 21.
What year was this again, timeline wise, in terms of collective timeline?
I was there 1989 to 1991. Wow.
And that's remarkable, because I would have been like a groupie. I was like, oh my God,
I was like, how did I? Store. Yeah, one of my professors, Jim Grant, started the Sufi Center of Boston.
Jesus. Wow.
So he taught, and he also had a PhD in psychology. He taught us theories of personality by telling us what the Western tradition would say about certain, different kinds of personality issues and styles. And then he would tell us Sufi stories. Right. It was the best educational experience of my life. I was a young man who had started in this direction. Wait, I get a master's degree and all this stuff. It was the best experience of my life.
So now, I mean, we all know, because we're 30 years some odd later, we know this is verified science, and you have a lot more of a proliferation of this knowing, and it's very commonplace now. You have so much of this in day to day. Now people are soaking this up. Back then, it's remarkable. And again, that's why I commended you when we first met. And I was like, wait, what? You went to school and you know, that was a way shower, as we call it. So I'm curious, in terms of, at this juncture, what techniques and practices stuck with you for the audience? Maybe some of them do these practices, some have no experience, because we have, as you know, a wide breadth of people that watch the show. So
Sure.
What would you say were early in your life? And obviously it's morphed, because we may talk about ultra running and other tools that you've developed. Back then, early, Paul, what were the tools that really stuck out as your favorites, if you're inspired or it resonates, to share?
Sure. There's a number of different practices, but the two that really stuck with me for years in my 20s and 30s, one was, I still sit every day, so some sitting meditation. These days it's 7 minutes a day.
And
So
do you do it in silence? What's your style of meditation for those that are advanced like myself that may be listening?
Yeah, it's pretty simple mindfulness meditation. Either watching the breath, noticing a sound or some sensation that's in the room, just like really simple, like getting tuned into the moment. And then, like these days, my longer practices are moving practices. And that's the ultra running or being in nature, things like that. But those 7 minutes a day, back then I would meditate a half hour a day. On a busy day, 20 minutes. Again, I was learning meditation from many traditions, but meditation. And then the other one for me was writing, particularly poetry.
Really?
For my late 20s and early 30s, I was in a multicultural poetry group in rural New Mexico called Luz y Sombra, light and shadow, or light and darkness. Just writing as a spiritual practice is also something that I was deeply involved in for many, many years.
It's like modern day Def Poetry Jam that they had for a while. It was like the pre-era before.
Totally. And like reading David White, the poet, and like Rumi and Hafiz and all, just how poetry helps us find the magical in the day-to-day experience. And then particularly with this group, explore difference. I live in New Mexico. New Mexico is the language people use. It's funny language. We're the first majority minority state. In other words, we have the highest proportion of people of color in the first state to have over 50% of the population. Largely because of our large Latinx population, and we have the second highest indigenous population outside of Alaska. So you put those two together with just people from around the world, and New Mexico is the first state to have a majority people of color. And that was a key theme in this poetry group. So learning about difference and writing about difference, and me as a Jew from New York, and my friend Joe Sidio, whose wife was the postmistress in the little town that I was, that we were writing in, and his dad had been the mayor of Espanola, New Mexico, which is a very storied place. Anyway, it was a very multicultural experience. It was writing and finding the magic in life and exploring difference in that group, which was just fabulous.
I love that. You read my mind. I was going to ask, what did the poetry do for you? And it sounds like the meditation that you do and did is more awareness-based and shifting. Real quick, before we move on your journey, what, as a practitioner and having a degree in this field of mind-body connection, what can you elaborate a little bit, if it resonates, Paul, for the audience, to say more on the science geeky side, maybe to the best of your, current experience? What does it do for you, and what does it do for a practitioner when they do these awareness-based meditation practices like Vipassana or MSBR, for instance?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of layers of it. One is, if you look at a book called The Power of Full Engagement by Tony Schwartz, what we're learning about high performance these days in multiple domains. Tony Schwartz started coaching high level athletes and like Olympic athletes. And then the business people went to him and said, wait, if you can improve an athlete's performance, can you improve mine? And the business people had a lot more money. So now he coaches business people. That recovery and pause is incredibly important. Like, I'm a 53-year-old ultramarathon runner. We need to pay, especially as we get older, like in our modern economies and in business and in leadership, we think we can just like keep it at like a flat line of high level performance for like forever. And one of the things that the research tells us, and what Tony and his team demonstrated, is humans aren't wired that way. So if you think back into the old days of like before computers, like how did we survive? We survived in groups, we survived in communities, and we would do big things like go on a hunt or have a big build. You know, I live in New Mexico. The Pueblos here are these like adobe like apartment buildings, like built like 3 and 4 and 5. It takes a lot of work. I've built with Adobe. It's a lot, it's awesome, but it's a lot of work, right? So you work really hard, and then you feast and you rest and you sleep, and then you work really hard and then you feast. That's how we evolved. But in modern life, we think we can pin the needle to some optimal performance level. And what happens when we pin the needle is that steadily our performance goes down. And we're like, what's wrong with you? Nothing's wrong with you. You're just not working with your nervous system. So Bingo. On one level, just on a kind of performance and mental level, and also physical performance, like if you're a runner or whatever your sport is, we need those breaks. And meditation shifts us out of, if you look at the brain science, meditation shifts us out of that sort of very active kind of linear thinking kind of mind, task oriented, and back into like a neutral, like the parts that tend to overfire, meaning like get inefficient because we're at that like, you know, red line. What meditation does is quickly kind of get us back to neutral, and then we can go back into high performance mode. It's like getting, you know, extra sleep or taking extra recovery days if you're an athlete. So that little 7 minutes, you know, that functionality kicks into place. Something like with 2 minutes of fairly trained meditation time, we get that neutral kind of status. The other thing it does is that's really important for me, and I think a lot of us right now, I hope a lot of us are thinking about this, our immune systems, psychoneuroimmunology, right? The
PNI.
The PNI, the health aspect of having some practice that helps us shift into neutral. Herbert Benson, the guy who wrote the relaxation response, he was one of the first people to document this with very a lot of scientific rigor, is that we just have a more robust immune response when we take that time to find that neutral place. It has cumulatively, it has an immense impact on our immune system. And I don't know about anybody else, but I've been thinking about immune systems lately in the midst of the biggest pandemic of our lifetime, right?
I love that. And it's straight out of the proverbial horse's mouth, because again, you're citing some colleagues, some contemporary peers and people that you kind of either studied with or were institutions parallel.
Yeah, they were older. They're all like 20, 30 years older than me. Still? But I happen to be one of the young people saying, this is important stuff. You guys go get an MBA. I'm going to go study this.
Correct. Early adopter, as they would call it.
Totally early adopter. I interviewed somebody on my podcast. This like describes my life. Her name, Radical Health. Evelise Adino. And she said, I asked her like, what was her parting thought for social entrepreneurs on my podcast? And she said, Paul, sometimes people who are doing innovative work, we need to realize we weren't wrong. We're not wrong. You're just early. I've been early over and over again in my life. So many times, like now I think it's awesome as a, mid-20s person trying to find himself and what do I do for work in the world? It wasn't easy. Now it's awesome because I have like literally decades of experience in the kind of things that a lot of people now are trying to figure out, like conscious business and leadership and like social entrepreneurship. Back then, I knew I needed to study this stuff. I could not, but it was early, and that wasn't always easy.
And we're definitely going to unpack some of the really amazing groups and things you've helped found and all that, because that's very poignant for some people that are going to listen to this. I love what you said. We didn't plan on this, as it's very improvised, as people know. This notion of being early and the frustration that comes with it as an early adopter, because I talk about it as being a new earth leader, you know, being an ascended leader. And I really love that you brought this up, Paul, because you probably had to deal with this. So how did you deal with that? Because I find myself, which I'm, you know, almost 20 years younger than you. And it's this notion of, I still only recently have been able to alchemize this early adopter, we'll call it frustration, where, you know, that you've maybe seen the dancing video where there's the early guy who's dancing and then the other guy comes and then so it's like that not all of us, when we get up and dance, are as confident and are like as secure. After a while of dancing and doing this new dance and nobody's joining right away, it could feel a little like, holy shit, what the F am I doing? Am I crazy? How did you grapple with that, since you brought it up? Because I'm sure many people are on the fence that are listening. I know I talk to a lot of clients and prospects that go, Haas, I want to do this. It's what people aren't ready for it, or blah, 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 blah. So talk to us about that, because you brought up, and that hits home for me. So I'm curious what your perspective was and how did you alchemize that?
It's a great question, Haas. So my first 15 years of my career, when I graduated from Lesley, I had this degree. It was a master's in counseling. So I went into community mental health. And so the first couple of years, I actually went to work for a men's center in Amherst, Massachusetts. And we were doing really cool things about engaging men as fathers and betters intervention and just helping men build EQ and relationship skills, right? So I went into a circle where this was back in the day when men's work was, you know, Robert Bly and all. It wasn't our tradition, that particular kind of men's work. But men's work and spirituality there was a lot of men who the more in the box version of masculinity wasn't working and were seeking alternatives. So I just went and started to work for, you know, I became the intake coordinator. I got trained to do batters intervention when I was like 23, I think 24. And that became my work. So I've always, and then when I moved to New Mexico, there's beautiful challenges in New Mexico. Like we oftentimes wind up at the bottom of some lists, like average income or drug addiction rates. We have a lot of challenges here, but one of the beautiful things about New Mexico House is who lives here and the importance of certain kind of values like spirituality. So like, for instance, I did quite a bit of my community work in my community mental health 15 years of my career with the tribes here, they're called the Pueblos in most cases. And a good portion of my work was on you don't have to tell the Pueblos that spirituality might be helpful for some, like they won't work with you. I mean, they'll like use, if you have some funds and a grant, they're happy to like hear what you got to give them. But like, if you're going to do any deep work on the Pueblos, you have to be talking about spirituality because it's the absolute center of the culture. And I didn't have all the answers, but I was a white guy with a degree who was willing to look at some out of the box solutions. Like we started looking at, many people know what restorative justice is, and that's older kids who get in trouble with the legal system, probation and courts and judges. We were looking at how to bring similar kinds of circle-based restorative practices, but we were looking at it for younger kids who usually wind up in the child protective system. Right?
Wow.
And we were using circle-based processes like, how can we use informal resources like the tribal elders or grandma or somebody at school to help this kid? There was an allegation that dad got drunk and kid got hurt. Okay. We got to keep the kids safe. One way to do it is what traditional like social work and courts would say, but another way would do it is if you all family, I would go to the families and say, if you all are open to it, there's this thing called family group decision making. You all will decide, your extended family, and you can use any resource you want. You just got to show me that the kid's going to stay safe. And if dad has a drinking problem and he doesn't feel aligned to going to AA because that's a spiritual path, and he wants to do it in a sweat lodge or, with the tribal leader, and they're going to work on it, great. Get me the tribal leader to just say he's going to meet with dad at whatever frequency. And is he showing up? And are you guys doing good work? You are? Great. Check the box, move on. Right. So we were doing out of the box stuff that like incorporated spirituality because of where I chose to place myself. So that's how I navigated some of that.
I love that. Because, I mean, as an early adopter, it's a belief. It sounds like you also believed in the course and had faith in your trajectory because, like you said, you were like, this stuff's going to be important. You had the sense, the hunch, we'll call it, or the nudge, and you went with it. And then I love how you said it. I would call it go find your tribe or go where you're, that other people are passionate or sharing that purpose. And I love how you said, go, it's where you chose to place yourself. And I think it's very important because so many of us try to force ourselves, at least I did, force ourselves into a box versus going where the flow is taking us or where the natural rhythm and flow may be taking us. So I love that you said that and you brought it forth that way. And also great on the psychology portion because of what you said about performance, because I think the science has obviously verified that, to touch upon that, what you said a few minutes ago, because there's so much of that in natural wisdom that we forget when you talked about the plateau, pause and rest. So you're bringing forth some golden stuff. So when you worked in these indigenous traditions and you were around these people and you're bringing forth more counsel work and more family dynamics, constellation work, well, how do you see that transposed to leadership, or what did that teach you about leadership back then? And how did that shape you in your leadership?
Because I was working in communities where they're not like my own. I was born in Queens, I was born in New York City. I'm a New York Jew, right, at birth. I've been in New Mexico since 1993. So this place has had a huge impact on me. But originally, where my culture is as a New York Jew. And, Taos Pueblo, which many people might be familiar with, maybe one of the more recognizable communities in New Mexico, just to give people a reference point. It's the oldest inhabited building in North America.
Wow.
People have been living there in a relatively sustainable way for 1,000+ years.
Wow.
You could still drink the water in the areas where they manage it.
Wow.
And working there, because I was working with kids, we were working with kids, but because I was part of a team working with kids, they're like, look, there's certain things we don't usually teach outsiders, but you're here to help our kids, and you have to have a context of where this person sits. And we don't, how can I say this? The Native communities that I had the honor to be part of a team that we're serving, they don't think about humans the way modern culture thinks about humans. This individual I first way of being in the world is not native, like literally not native, at least to the communities here in New Mexico. It's a different approach to what it means to be a human. And I heard somebody, a native elder, sharing recently that in modern culture and in the US specifically, we start off with our rights. That's like our fundamental rights. And in Native communities, at least in New Mexico, they start off fundamentally with your responsibility. We lead with, in the US, like you have this inalienable right to pursue health and happiness, right? Et cetera, all that stuff. And that stuff is great. But there's very little attention paid to what was given to us and what we are being asked to steward. And it's 180 degrees in Indigenous communities. We are given a gift, and it's our job to steward it going forward. Just to be a human being alive on this beautiful planet with water to drink and food to eat and clothes to wear and other beautiful humans to interact with. That is such an incredible gift. And it's our job to steward it going forward. And so what do you even say to people who teach you that other than just be grateful for the rest of your life?
That's potent. That's potent on a lot of levels because it's positioned you to be a global citizen, right? You talked about the poetry earlier. You're talking about this notion of embracing differences, finding the commonality, and then being welcomed and being taught these various things. And then even more potent, this notion of leading from responsibility versus rights. That's a really powerful distinction that you're bringing forth, a very good contrast, because I can see underneath that rights, leading with from rights, would lend oneself to entitlement. I'll call it that. And this notion of leading from responsibility, very simple and profound and multidimensional, because then you're considering, firstly, what is my responsibility with what I've been given? So I love that. And you're right. It's a very huge reframe and a shift in awareness. It's beautifully put.
Yeah, so I'm very grateful. I mean, I've had good Western teachers and good Indigenous teachers. Like, yeah, I've been blessed with some really, I'm very lucky man. Yes.
Yeah, well, I feel that. And I appreciate you saying this because this is like what in the ancient mystical orders, they used to call it the age of synthesis we're entering into. And it's very much unifying East and West and bringing the potency of these indigenous traditions and showing the practicum, which is very much what we're talking about today. So where did that take you then? So you're doing this counseling work, you're doing this family constellation work. What was next in Paul's metamorphosis and unfolding, the cooking of the man we see before us?
Cooking of the man. So, yeah, so it's not exactly linear, but basically about a third of the way through my sort of community mental health career, getting to know what some of the issues were in New Mexico. I lived here for a while. And in 1998, I believe, 97 or 98, I don't have it in front of me, we started a men's resource center here in New Mexico. And we were looking around and just seeing that, men in America, you can look at all the indicators, we die. There's a lot of entitlement and privilege there, like in terms of like, we tend to make more money than women, and that inequality has gotten larger during COVID, not less. So there's some ways that article you were referring to earlier, right? That the title of the article was called Male Anxiety. Right? And how much male anxiety contributes to just distress and pain and suffering for those around us. So historically, there's been more money that goes to men. And if you go way back, women literally couldn't have a credit card or a bank account. You don't have to go that far back for that, right? That's changed, but there's some gender training differences, and men were acting out that difference and causing a lot of suffering in innumerable ways. We kill ourselves more, way more, have more incidents with substance abuse and drunk driving, and we won't go see a doctor. Women are much more likely to access healthcare. Men are like, I'm tough, I'm fine, right? Like, I'm good. And then like a crisis happens because we don't do preventative care, right? So like just over and over and over again, we just saw, men are more likely to be physically abusive, men are more likely to be emotionally abusive. And for me, those behaviors come from somebody who has not been given permission to be a vulnerable, connected human. They come from somebody who's being driven by power and looking for material gain and not seeing the value of human relationships and that we all need each other. So we did that for about 8 years, started the men's center here, and similar kind of thing, helping men learn more about relationship skills, emotional intelligence, engaging young men as fathers. If somebody's like becomes a dad at 18, I know what it's like for me to become a dad at 33.
Wow.
At 18, it's like, that's a whoa, right? Especially if they didn't have a dad, right? Or their dad wasn't particularly present in their lives. So so that was the work that I did for the latter part of my mental health career.
That's really potent. So let's pause here on that topic that we exchanged on LinkedIn. I was like, you're speaking my lingo, this notion of giving permission to be vulnerable and connected. So 2 questions. in terms of this topic of what I call the sensitivity problem in terms of the alpha culture, right? This notion of, okay, what do we do when Western society, as that documentary a decade ago, we're all about bigger, better, faster, steroids and yoke up and crush it and all that. I love that you said it's the permission to be vulnerable and feel connected within. So the first question is, what do you see as the landscape for any leaders that may be listening that are in masculine form? What do you see as the utility? Obviously, you're alluding to the health ramifications, the anxiety ramifications. What do you see for the naysayers that are like, all right, weakness has no place in business? Let's call that out.
Yeah. So here's the data that I've seen, right?
Yeah, talk to us about that. Yeah.
The data I've seen is that your IQ, your intelligence, your brain power, right? Your knowledge base, let's call that 1.
Okay.
Right? It's a 1x. That's your EQ and your relational intelligence, just pure, how much do you contribute to your company's financial well-being? EQ is 8 times more indicative of how much you actually contribute.
In terms of ROI.
ROI. The ROI of EQ is 8 times more than IQ.
Wow. Okay.
8 times. So if you're a leader and you don't care about 8 times 800% ROI, that's fine. Cool. Right. If you do care, go do some research and, notice what we now know about, Google studied this in their Search Inside Yourself program. It's Google, right? They're fantastic. I've met Ming, who wrote that book. There's just really strong data about what happens in just a pure ROI when cultures don't pay attention to relationships. We also are now seeing it. You can also study the data about the Great Resignation. Fancy language to say we are having the biggest disruption in our workforce in our lifetimes. Why? Because so many leaders, especially male leaders, not my opinion, that's the research. We just had Dennis Consorte from business.com on the podcast. It's a small to medium-sized business data crunching agency. Wow. And Dennis told us all about who's leaving and why. And if you don't care about keeping your people, have fun with that. But if you care about keeping good people, there is a ton of research that creating psychological safety and being mindful of what is going on in people's relational lives. We also know that women and people of color are leaving organizations at a much higher rate because they're reporting that their managers aren't treating them well. And so they're like, screw it. A large number of people who are leaving are either looking for work that's more values aligned, more purpose aligned, even if it means a pay cut. They'll leave. You might not even be able to buy them off and keep them there, at least for very long, even if you pay them more money. They'll go work somewhere else where the value, or we're in the, and this is again from Dennis Consorte at business.com, we're in the largest wave of entrepreneurship in 4 generations. People are like, screw corporate. None of y'all give a shit about me. I'm going to go start my own thing. So if you're a leader and you're saying, I don't need to do this, all those soft skills, right? Say goodbye to your people now, your best people, because your best people, they're going to leave and they're going to figure out a way to make a really good living without you.
So now that you've addressed their pain point and they're interested and hooked, so what steps could they take real quick before we move on to, more of leveraging spirituality and how you've done it? Which leads us to Awarepreneurs and impact. What can they do if they're listening and they're like, okay, shit, you got my attention. What do I do? What steps can a man take who does not know anything about EQ sensitivity? Or let's say they're a novice or newbie.
Yeah, I think 2 books that can be really useful. The Search Inside Yourself, because it's Google, very precise. It's fun. Ming has all these cartoon, but it's like, there's graphs, there's data, and real concrete exercises. He was an engineer at Google, but he actually realized that Google was undervaluing emotional intelligence skills and made the business case. And Google said, yes, they've run, I don't even remember.
A lot.
Like tens of, it was 60,000 people like 4 or 5 years ago. I don't even know how many people they've run through at Google through Search Inside Yourself. And now there's a whole leadership institute called the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. That's one book, highly recommend it. And then I was really honored and blessed to work, a client of mine wrote the best-selling mindful business book in Canada of all time. Catherine Bell wrote a book called The Awakened Company.
Yeah. One more time, because I talked over you. One more time. What's the name?
Yeah, The Awakened Company.
Awakened Company. Beautiful.
Yeah, and Catherine talked to all kinds of leaders. She had the most successful executive place firm in Canada of all time. It was a Profit 100 company, which is basically their term for a Fortune 100 company. In Canada, they call it a Profit 100. She built it in 6 years using these principles. And the main thing to know is that when Catherine and her team did a placement at executive level, they only work with C-suite, did a lot of CEOs. Their placements stuck at a rate that nobody in Canada had ever seen. And if you ask Catherine, why did they stick? It's because they paid attention to emotional intelligence. They also did some other cool stuff like the Enneagram, right? They used some really cool tools, but basically they did a very deep dive of values and relationship styles so that they would put the right person in the right team, and then they stuck. And if anybody has done any research on what happens, especially at the CEO, if you put a new CEO and they pop out within a year, like it just wrong fit, the implications, if you're a publicly traded company, the impact on your stock is huge. If you're privately, you're not publicly traded, the production in the entire company is like impacted for years to come. You don't want to get this wrong. Is basically the short answer. And Catherine is like one of the best geniuses I've ever seen. So those are two great books.
I love that.
To start to get your, get a sense of what the conversation is and what some of the research is.
And then the second question before we move on, since I had Cordelia on this season, talk about what motherhood, since so much of being a leader isn't only your business, because your business is an extension of you, it's also your personal life. And you brought it up real quickly before we move and shift to this phase of Awarepreneurs and Wisdom 2.0. What do you see as fatherhood? In terms of, you brought it up earlier, and what would you say are the evolve, let's call it evolve. I know there's so many catchphrases, a conscious father, divine masculine, blah, blah, blah. What tomato, what do you see from your experience having done this work as a practitioner and as a father yourself, bringing those together? What would you see as the evolution or the new paradigm of fatherhood? What do you see that as?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. Just off the top of my head, there's a fabulous guy named Ben Kilroy who has a podcast called The Business of Fatherhood.
I think I've heard that name.
Yeah, you might want to have him on as a guest if you want, or anybody, like, go check out Ben's work, go check out his podcast. He's an awesome guy. He's thinking a lot about this. What do I say, House? Being a human is definitely a learning adventure, right? But, and the two like places that have rubbed up against my like rough edges more than any other journeys has been, one, being a dad, and two, conscious entrepreneurship. Like, these are fierce journeys. I mean, at least for me. Maybe like, oh, I had a kid, it was awesome from day one. Like, nope, it was really, 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 really hard. And then there's people who be like, I launched my business and the money started coming in from day one. And it was like so glass smooth. Nope. Really, 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 for this human, really, I built a unicorn
right away on my first try, and I went public right away. Yeah. Exactly.
There are people who do that. That has not been my journey. So just it's been awesome and hard and beautiful. Yeah. I was telling my girlfriend last night, we were walking around while roasted vegetables were in the oven and cooking. We were going for a walk while they were roasting, and I was just talking. I was remembering my daughter was colicky. We didn't know what was going on at the time. We lived on a farm, and I was growing a lot of like kale and Brussels sprouts and broccoli. Well, it turns out that family, when my ex was nursing her, it was giving her really, really bad gas, but it took us 4 months to figure it out. And I wore a hole in the carpet because I would just get up in the middle of the night and I'm walking this little creature, and I had maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and then she'd wake up and cry, and her mom would breastfeed her, and I would just walk her and she would fall asleep. It was called the monkey hold, right? So you have your hand like this, and their arms and legs would hang down, and I'd bounce. Or the football hold is also another. I used to be a football player in high school. And I just bounce her and she'd fall asleep. But then as soon as I sat down, like it was something about the movement, and my hand on her belly would calm all the, the pain and the discomfort from all that gas in her stomach. It took us 4 months to figure, maybe 5. And I was sleeping like 2 or 3 hours a night, and then just walking her in the living room for the rest. And then maybe I'd get like a 5-minute nap. I'd finally sit down, she'd fall asleep. And as soon as I fell asleep, if she realized there was no more movement, she'd start crying again. It was exhausted for months. I was almost hallucinating. I was scared to drive at times. But that's what was, like parents do things like that because you love your kid and you need to work, and like we figured it out. But it was one of the fiercest practice. I mean, at this point, with a 21 going to be going on 22-year-old, it's a whole different level. But those earlier years, I had no reference point for that. It was awesome and magical, and just like scorch your like hair back on a like hot Albuquerque day. Like, wow, what is going on here, and how do you even do this with care?
I love that. And there's so much, because I used to do full-time business law and help a lot of entrepreneurs. I may have mentioned that to you. And as you said that, I go, I mean, this is a beautiful analogy, because you did say entrepreneurship and fatherhood were the fiercest journeys for you, because there's so much allegory there too, that you don't know what's going to happen with this business baby you're creating. I used to call it you're birthing a business baby. There's growing pains. You have no freaking clue. You got to be attentive. There's sacrifice, it sounds like, involved. So really beautiful parallels, because where other people on the show have talked about motherhood, and that's the nurturing side. And we don't have to make it only physical, as these are energies or archetypes, and alpha and omega are really ways of being. So we've talked about the nurturing. I love this dutifulness is what I hear you bringing out, the sacrificing dutifulness of you really being like, okay, I got to keep doing this, and then mastering it. And then the rhythm, right? That's so beautifully allegorical too, because you got to find that right rhythm and balance as an entrepreneur, as you did balancing your baby to get that colic symptom right. So I love that.
The guy, I forget his name, the guy who wrote the 5 love languages.
Yeah.
So that he would call that acts of service, right? You walk your kid in the middle of the night because your kid has colic, right? And he just wrote like a follow-up to that book, The 5 Love Languages at Work.
Wow.
So like literally he's languaging, he's finding some crossover for those. I wish I can remember his name to give him credit. It is just escaping me at the moment.
Well, 5 Love Languages is out there, so you can Google it, and it eludes me too. So that's good to know. So another book for the audience or resources, The 5 Love Languages at Work, which is a good transition. Because so now where did you go on your journey, which it's almost like this last leg of the journey, which led you to more of this, what I call bringing soul to business. So you talked about it as leveraging spirituality in business when we first met. So talk to us about this leg of your journey, which leads us to Awarepreneurs.
Yeah, so it was beautiful work, and this community work and engaging men and looking at intergenerational trauma. I got really tired. I got compassion fatigue as a short, and I got really, part of it was we were doing really hard work. And then at this time I was like a nonprofit director, and I was trying to fund the work and help do some of the work and help my friends do the work. And it was exhausting house. And eventually I burned. At that time I was a dad. So like, I'm a minimalist. I don't need a ton of money, but like a nonprofit director in one of the poorest states in America, like that was just there was a lot to hold there. So 2007, 2008, I launched my business. But 2007, I was tired. I was ready for change, and started hearing about coaching, and like the internet was starting to be more of a thing. 2008, I got onto Twitter with a friend of mine who was also needing to reinvent himself, and turned out to write a book called Wisdom 2.0. His name is Soren Gordhammer. Book didn't do that much, but he kept going with it and decided, the reason it didn't get a whole lot of traction with the book is because people want to talk to each other in person about these topics. And it blew up.
Back to relationships again, back to the importance of relationships. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So we got on Twitter in 2008. Nobody knew what Twitter was, at least in New Mexico in 2008. But there was this very kind of, there was this small but very dynamic group of folks who were really interested in conscious business and positive psychology in business and spirituality in business. And I'm talking like, suddenly we were at Google learning about search inside yourself. Before Google was playing their card. They were teaching tens of thousands of people about emotional intelligence and mindfulness as a way to both increase performance and also reduce stress and try to retain their best people. But they didn't want to tell anybody because they're like, we're a tech company and we're teaching basically meditation in our tech company. And like, is this weird? So there were all these different, then we got invited in 2009. So I'm like just starting my business. And I got invited to Zappos, Tony Hsieh and the leadership team at Zappos.
God rest his soul. Yeah.
They were a little more explicit about it. They were using positive psychology principles at Zappos. They had a coach, a full-time coach, several. Later on, they moved up to several. But at the time we were there, they had like a 1.5 full-time equivalent. They met with every employee every year to work on their happiness goals, not how to sell more shoes, but on their happy. They were using positive psychology under the theory that if you had happier employees, they would sell more shoes. The company would keep their best people.
That's so insane, Paul.
So I was there.
What?
Like,
if I'm more motivated and happy and don't feel like shit, I'll do better at work? What?
I know, call me crazy, right? So I'm like a nonprofit guy, you know, like this community mental health guy who's like, there's got to be a way to leverage business for good. I didn't even know the vocabulary of social entrepreneurship back then. That was more like early 2011, 2012, it started to kind of take off. I was early again. Here's another time I was early. I was trying to figure out conscious business and social entrepreneurship, didn't have the vocabulary, but suddenly I'm at Zappos on the day they're handing out t-shirts to the entire company workforce saying, thank you for making us $1 billion a year company. Wow. And I'm sitting down with my old little smartphone because it was 2009, recording Tony Hsieh and Paul Zelizer talking about positive psychology in business because Tony was so excited. Like I knew a lot about psychology. I have a master's degree in psychology and psychoneuroimmunology and in emotional intelligence. I know shit about business. I had been at ED, you know, I was reading, I was sort of getting up to speed, but I'm like, oh my God, I can't. So it was one of those, and it was just like being early again, Haas, and being open to being in conversation. And people like Tony and the folks at Google, they were looking for some help with how do we make the business case and what's some of the research here. And again, I had this very kind of out of the box graduate education. So I knew some of the research and some of the neuroscience that they were trying to articulate. So I found myself in these experiences, just like
good pairing, good compliment.
How the heck did I get to Zappos talking about their $1 billion a year company and the strategies they're using to grow? But that's where I was. So I'm like, all right, let's do this, right? So that's the true story of the transition. It was not a smooth transition, but I had to figure it out, right?
Well, I love that. Real quick, because earlier we talked about this notion of being an early adopter and, you know, believing and then going, you know, where you chose to place yourself. I like that because you subtly said it. You stayed open. You know, you said stay open to the conversation. I see it as staying open, period. You know, staying open could imply having that childlike curiosity. And I think that's another valuable point that I wanted to highlight, that keeps a leader going. Because yeah, you're right. I hear this so many times, not only on the show with other people, when I was on my sabbatical, even before that, talking, you know, with business executives and luminary leaders, that I happen to end up here. I mean, I think we talked about this offline. Same for my journey. I wouldn't have thought I'd be a business healer, if you want to call it whatever adage you want to use for what I do. And it's interesting. So you talked about something really near and dear to both of us, leveraging business for good. Impact, because we're both big on that keyword in our branding. I think when I first met you, you were impactpreneurs is a word you were using or something to that effect. So where did you shift and say, okay, I need to, because we talked about this offline for the audience's sake of you're all about the nuts and bolts now, the granular, the grassroots, if you want to call it that. What shifted you? Because here you are at a very high level place, you know, doing Wisdom 2.0, which many listeners may have heard of or have even participated in. It was my dream to go, and then they stopped. So
welcome to COVID, right?
Yeah, right. And so what shifted within you? And then let's bring this home in terms of what you do now and what you see the business leadership landscape looking like, because you talked about something very brilliant. This great resignation is actually an influx, this huge exponential growth of everybody stepping into entrepreneurship, which I call their soul's calling. More and more people saying, you know what, fuck this. Pardon my French. You were the one that told me if I could drop an F-bomb. How come I'm dropping F-bombs and the New York Jew is not? Huh? So there's this notion.
I think I had a curse word or two in there earlier. I might represent. But,
for the audience's sake, Paul was wondering, is it right if I use profanity? I said, have you really watched this show before? I'm talking about occultism at times. So
yeah,
there is this funny thing that, you saw happening. What it was that, because we did talk about it offline for the audience's sake. What shifted in you that brought you to what you're doing now? And then expand on that if you can for our sake. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, just both my training and circumstance, like the pathway for me to build my coaching business. And, I was the director of social media for Wisdom 2.0 and on the marketing team there. So like that, I leveraged the conscious business frame because it was blowing up all around me. And I was like, sure, I'll go for that ride. That gets me, I still lived in New Mexico. My daughter was here. In that process of the change, my life fell apart, my work fell apart. We lost our biggest grant. My daughter's mom and I got divorced. I mean, it was like pretty painful transition, right? And I didn't want to not be here as a dad. So I stayed in New Mexico, but everything interesting was happening on the West Coast, mostly in California, a little bit in London, but I couldn't not be present as a dad. So I stayed in New Mexico, how to figure it out online, had zero training on how to use the internet to grow a business or anything like that. So got some training. Anyway, because of my, graduate training and my many years of experience in the realm of the spiritual and in the realm of the communities I had served, there was a lot of things that transferred into the conscious business world. Emotional intelligence. I had taught an emotional intelligence, co-taught an emotional intelligence parenting class. Wow. A colleague of mine had started it. There were a lot of moms there. They started saying, what about the dads? She said, will you co-lead this with me? My daughter was like 3 at the time. I said, I know a little bit about being a dad, but she said, yeah, but you know a lot about emotional intelligence. I said, all right. My colleague had 7 children. She got the parenting part down, but I had, so anyway, I'd had a lot of training and experience with emotional intelligence in those kind of frames, years, decades at that point of meditating myself. So as that all started to take off, like it just presented myself, when you're on the marketing team of Wisdom 2.0, Wisdom 2.0 is focused mostly on the large tech leaders. What's going on Facebook, what's going on LinkedIn, what's going on at Airbnb, et cetera, et cetera. But a large number of people who are in the actual audience are people like you and me, smaller, more lean and more innovative. Facebook, they have a compassion program, but Facebook is only going to move the needle to, as far as I can tell, in the near future, they're only going to go so far. Right? I
agree.
The people who are sitting in the audience with the smaller micro businesses or 50 people companies, they wanted to move the needle a lot. And I was like, nobody at this conference is talking to that audience. They're all really busy talking about LinkedIn. And so basically I was like, and it was huge. The conference grew from like 600 people to 1,000 people to 1,400 people, eventually went to 4,000 people. There were like 2,000, probably more like 2,500 people in the room trying to figure out how to grow and market these kind of businesses that you and I have. And nobody was like helping them out. And I'm like, I'll help you out. It's a little more complicated than that, but mostly not. I was like, I like you people. Let's talk. Come on down. And one thing led to another. And yeah, that's pretty much how I started.
Why does this matter to you? Why did it matter? And why does it matter more now that you've been doing it 15 plus years?
Not quite, but yeah, January will be 15.
Well, there you go. I rounded up. The lawyers
Yeah,
estimate upwards. We always want to aim for a pie in the sky.
14.6 years, if you will, I guess. We're at October, maybe 14.7
I appreciate
years.
your Aquarian precision, brother. I appreciate your Aquarian precision. Us Sagittariuses are much more loosey.
Oh, yeah. Look at you spreading misinformation. What can I, you know, I saw that there were good-hearted people who were trying to make a living. And here's the really honest answer. We were talking about this before we hit record. We just got from some of the smartest minds of our planet, literally called a code red report from the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change. We're in a mess. If you're not noticing that as a leader, wake the fuck up. I don't know what to tell you. We're in a mess, right? And we knew that 10 years ago, or at least I had a pretty good sense of that, but we're like in a mess. And a big part of that mess from where I sit is that in a modern economy, like hopefully everybody listening to the show, wisdom teachers have told us that our attention is the single most precious resource we have, our energy and our attention and our intention. Yes. In a modern economy, adult humans, unless you're a trust funder, which have fun with that, but majority of us need to work, and we spend more time working than anything else we do with our waking hours. Mm-hmm. I love to run. I'm an ultra marathoner. I love my friends. I love to cook. I love to garden. I love my girlfriend. I love my family. All those things I spend as much, and I still work more than any of them. And I work much less than most modern humans. Right? Mm. And I would say that the majority of humans on planet Earth, certainly in the US or in North America, are doing work that's not aligned with our values. If you really get honest with it, right? Not my value, your values. Are you going to work with the highest concentration of the most powerful thing you have as a human being? And if you want the world that we have right now, the way you get it is have adult humans spend the majority of their waking hours doing something that's not aligned with their values. That's how you get here. And what I saw at Wisdom and other places, and now even more so in the social entrepreneur conversations, people are saying, we got to figure out how to line up our values with what we're doing for work. It's quite simple, but it's also absolutely revolutionary. If we had the majority of modern adults working in a way that was aligned with their values, our world would look radically different than what it looks like right now. Now, like, that's pretty easy. I know something about attention. I don't know all the answers about what kind of businesses people should be running, but there was a conference room of thousands of them. Let me go talk to them, see what they need, and figure out how to provide value there. And then even more so, as the social entrepreneur conversation started to get really robust, social entrepreneurship, if leaders don't know it, it is one of the fastest growing majors on college campuses around the world. Young people, if anybody's under 40, but especially if they're Gen Z, if you're not talking like climate change and you're not talking the various sustainable development goals at the United Nations, things like diversity, equity, inclusion, things like gender equity, if you're not paying attention to that, you're just going to lose your best people, period, right? It's not about, buying them nice lunches and, ping pong tables. It's about values. It's about values, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why is like, all right, if I can help be part of this movement and bring my care and attention to that, then in that same like responsibility to pass on a world to my, my child and the other, the future generations, then that's the highest leverage point I know how. And because of just circumstance, I wound up in some pretty high leverage conversations about all that. So I said, let me roll up my sleeve and go to work there.
I love that. And before we, hone in on what you're doing right now and your legacy, and to wrap up on that, it's interesting because you say it in different verbiage, and you got to be aligned energetically, as I call it, because that's the issue. It's the business ecosystem is going to be an extension of the leader and the leadership team. And if they're fragmented, then they're going to have fragmented ecosystems. And I love how you didn't approach it from a high level. You took it from a individualistic level, because many people talk about systems change. We need to change the infrastructures, the ecosystems, the way we do business, conscious capitalism. Yes. We also need conscious people. And I love that you're alluding to the aligning all of these adults into their passion, into what lights them up. And that's beautifully said. What do you, in terms of what do you see as limits or hurdles that we still have to face in terms of this leadership paradigm that's unfolding? Because I think you hit the nail on the head. In these indigenous traditions, they talked about these future generations, the rainbow children, the indigo children. I think that speaks to some people I mentor or I've gifted sessions to. Yesterday at a restaurant, I saw a 20-year-old and hey, blah, blah, blah. And she was like, oh, I needed to hear that. So I agree with you. Their souls are ripe to bring this forth. What do you see as what's left to shift, hurdles or things like that? Yeah.
Use the word paradigm.
Yeah.
And if anybody does some research on how that word came into our modern usage.
Ooh, talk to us, Goose.
Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, I think I'm pronouncing it, is the guy who talked about paradigm shift. If anybody's using that word, you're standing on his shoulders. And he talked about how entrenched leadership gets. And basically, he says, you know when paradigm shift usually happens? It's when the old guard dies. He's talking he was mostly studying paradigm shifts in academic
settings,
disciplines. And, when, a whole new physics came that was nonlinear and not Newtonian, it shifted when the old guard died, right? I think we don't have time for the old guard to die. What I think is happening now is the systems are changing mostly because there's a critical mass, especially people under 40, that are just leaving. They're just picking up, they're taking their ball and going. I was talking to a social entrepreneur that I coached yesterday. She posted a job. It paid well, but not great. She got 140 applicants, House.
Nice.
Why did she get it? Why do we have a great resignation? Why are companies all over the world say, I can't find anybody to hire? Some of it is you got to pay people half a livable wage. She's paying a livable wage, but it's not outrageous. It's because of purpose and values. Right. Her company is doing some of the most impactful work I've ever heard about. And people will leave their jobs. Some of the people applying had jobs that were paying 2 to 3 times as much as what she was going to pay, but she was offering purpose and values. And so people aren't waiting for these leaders that have been entrenched and doing things that are not aligned with the majority of humans' values right now. They're just picking up and leaving. Either they're going to go find every truly, not greenwashing, not impact washing, but every truly impactful organization. I know a lot of them. I mean, I have a podcast where I get to interview people. We just posted 220, episode number 220. Yes, wow. Every one of those with a leader that's doing really cool stuff. Those folks are having no trouble hiring anybody. They can't keep up with the number of, and the people who are doing business and either just I call it putting green lipstick on a pig. You can put all the green lipstick you want and say how your company is green. We're smarter than that. We know when you're putting green lipstick on a pig, and times have changed. It ain't going back. There's no undoing the Great Resignation. It's going to take decades to kind of sort it all. But for now, all you need to know as a leader is if you're not deeply connected to your values, and you're not speaking to the values of your ideal customer, it's only a question of when it all falls apart. I can't predict it. I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you at a certain point, your top talent is going to go work for somebody else, or they're going to start their own thing. We've never seen anything like it as what we're seeing right now.
I think Terence McKenna, I love to quote, very famous anthropologist and different woo-woo things he did, and scientist, said this is the peak of novelty. We're going to see things. He called it the end of time as we know it. It wasn't Armageddon. It's this notion of we're going to see things we've never seen because we're at an era collectively. So it speaks to at a very granular level what you're talking about. What do you see? And I usually ask this in the form of a legacy question. What do you see as in terms of your vision for when you're gone here? What do you see? Not necessarily the legacy of Awarepreneurs, the impact that Awarepreneurs will have. And inviting in this question in a broader sense, what do you envision the globe looking like, whether it be leadership, social entrepreneurship, however you feel inspired to respond to that?
It's a great question. From where I sit, what's happening right now is an unprecedented moment in human history. And that's true in general, but there's very specific way I mean that. I think we're in the midst of the largest mass movement that most people don't even know is happening. And very specifically, what that mass movement is around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 areas, if somebody hasn't checked them out. Greta Thunberg is part of this process, right? And everybody all the young people who are saying like just sustainable living and, you know, the racial reckoning that we're in the United States and around the world with Black Lives Matter and what happened after George Floyd was murdered. DEI is one of the sustainable development goals. And what's going on in the conversation about inequity for women in the workplace is actually getting worse because of COVID, and that needs to stop. That, you know, support and equity for girls and women is in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you put it all together, we are now in the biggest mass movement in the history of humans.
Wow.
And it's organized by the United Nations. Some people know they're part of it. Some people just have their content area. It doesn't matter. If you're working in one of these content areas, and then the 17th Sustainable Development Goal is look for ways to collaborate with other people doing other work. And some people are cognizantly doing that, and other people, it doesn't matter. Like pick one of these and pull on the lever as hard as you can, right? So the lever I'm pulling on is around sustainability at work, right? Helping people find work that will align with their values and help communities and our planet as opposed to harm them. I'm going to pull on that lever as hard as I can for the rest of my life. And, you know, I was talking to a female entrepreneur in Pakistan, and there aren't a lot of resources in either she's kind of straddling the conscious business space and the social entrepreneur space. The work she's doing is leveraging important frames from both. And there's very little information available to her in her natural business ecosystem, partially because she's a woman and partially because she's putting values at least as important as profit, and partially because she's also baking spirituality into what she's doing. You put that all together and she got nothing. There's lots of resources to help women start businesses, but you put it all together and, you know, she can listen to our podcast for free and hear from some of the top entrepreneurs in these spaces and be part of the conversation as much as somebody who lives in Silicon Valley or one of the most resources, you know, pick, you know, Hong Kong, pick any highly resourced community, right? She's in one of the lesser resourced places, but she can get up to speed and learn from like what's happening at the front lines. That's my job, is to help people find their way into their version of deeply values aligned work and help get them resources, whether it's I need a new website or I need to do Facebook ads from somebody who understands what the hell I'm talking about, to logos, to a lawyer. That's to emotional support. Like that's my job, is go find people who are doing that work and resource them with every cell in my body.
I love that. I love that because there's so much of a need as you're articulating for that, and it's showing the way and it's getting them the tools that they need and the resources and the wisdom. So that's really beautifully put. Where can they find the podcast for those listening? Because I know I'm going to put the details in the comment section. If they're listening only, where can they find the podcast if they're a social entrepreneur?
Yeah, at awarepreneurs.com. First part of the word awareness, second part of the word entrepreneurs, plural, awarepreneurs.com.
I love it. And I don't think you know this. I was working as a legal intern at the UN around the time that the sustainability goals were promulgated.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, I was working at the World Intellectual Property Organization.
See, you're part of the biggest movement that the planet's ever seen too, right?
I'm a troublemaker. Oh, no. Any parting words for the audience, Paul, that you'd like to share for this round? We may have you back, or who knows? There's going to be more in our future, I sense.
Well, first of all, just again, thank you, Huss, for holding space and providing this service. And to the leaders who are listening, I would just say there is wisdom in every tradition that I know about. I'm Jewish, so, you know, I will use that frame. that whatever we're doing here now has ripple effects for future generations. And anybody who's wanting to be in responsibility as opposed to rights, who wants to lead with that we have responsibilities to the future generations. If you're a leader, this is the time to kind of, if there is any residual, but what about mine, right? Me, mine. Again, I want us all to live a good quality of life. And me, and mine is part of what's destroying our planet. And if you're a leader that's watching this kind of show, I think you know what I'm talking about. And I just invite you, it's not just responsibility in a laden down way. Responsibility means response able. We're able to respond. And when we're able to respond, there's a sense of empowerment. There's a sense of right living. There's a sense of purpose. And so many people right now are feeling depressed, are feeling disempowered, are feeling like their agency is either not there or they don't know what to do with it. And when we become response able to respond in service to something, for me, it's the future generations. For me, it's all the relations of the trees and the water and the air. I was given clean water to drink, and I would sure like when I'm gone for water to still be available to humans to drink. I would still love there to be these beautiful mountains that I am so incredibly blessed to run in, like as often as I can. I want to be of service to that. So I want to be response able so I can be of service to that. So that's like, think about how you can be mindful who you want to be response able for and to.
I love that. I love that. You're using a lot of the lingo that I use, so I love that. It's very synchronistically aligned. I don't often say that on the show.
We did a brain dump.
We did.
Come on, man.
It's the Vulcan mind melt, right? It's Spock and
See, I don't have any hair to get in the way, so it's like it just comes.
It's aerodynamic. I didn't get a chance to shave for you. I was like feeling bad. I was like, oh no, we don't match. And then I shaved my beard. It's like, what are you doing, Haas? You're throwing off the caliber.
That's it, man.
No, I love that. And I love the way you shared that, because it is response capacity. It's your ability to hold that space as a leader, your ability to bring that forward. And I love that you envision that as a legacy, because it is very beautifully put to bring sustainability, to enjoy. Let's put another way, to enjoy what you do and to be in that passion and to do that. That's why I think you and I enjoy it. When somebody says thank you to me, I go, for what? For having fun? Okay. Yes, you're welcome. And I understand the impact I'm providing. It's more of, and I think that's what's beautiful about this, to leave the audience with this, that when you do this, it's no longer work. I don't call it work anymore. I know that sounds cheesy. It's I call it my craft, and it's play. And it's very much, I think, what we're espousing for everybody, that you're not only doing something that you're enjoying, that's impactful, that's going to help change the world as well. And that's what we're all about. Paul, thank you, brother. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing of yourself and from yourself. And thank you for listening and joining in to another episode of the Vulnerable Power Show. Check out Paul's podcast if you're a social entrepreneur for resources. He's got a community with beautiful, beautiful gelling. And as he shared, a lot of resources and tools that are available to you. And reach out. And more importantly, if this message inspired you, share this episode, because we both, Paul and I, have a collective mission. We have a shared purpose to bring about a collective future. So if you do that, you'll do your part in getting this wisdom out there. As always, thank you. Lots of love and light to each of you, and we'll see you here back soon. In the meantime, blessings and love to each of you.